I have to say that this was always intended to be an extreme weather event. And that is that we've intended from the first to address a number of weather questions. Whether climate change is real and grounded in empirical data, whether it poses real, imminent, or merely imaginary dangers to the quality of life and environment within Lower Merion. Whether climate action, such as the adoption and implementation of a greenhouse gas emission reduction strategy, should be a governmental priority on the same plane as police and fire protection, trash pickup, development, stormwater management, traffic control. Whether Lower Merion is as resilient as it can and will need to be in the face of the unavoidable consequences of climate change. Whether we can learn from the experience of industry and other municipalities about the advantages of sustainable energy planning, the political challenges that it involves, and the economic opportunities that it affords. Whether township government can and should play a role in influencing the energy decisions of the private sector. Whether the costs of climate action and resilience are exceeded ultimately by the costs of inaction. Now, the genesis of this workshop was a meeting between the Environmental Advisory Council and the board's Environmental Initiatives Committee, at which meeting we presented our 5-year environmental action plan. One of the goals of the EAC's 5-year plan is the adoption of a greenhouse gas emission reduction plan, something that the EAC has been advocating since at least 2012. Recognizing that not everyone has the same understanding of the concepts of climate change, climate action, resilience, sustainability, it was agreed by the two bodies that the EAC should conduct a workshop to illuminate these concepts. So the purpose of the workshop, this workshop then, is to lay the factual groundwork for policymaking in general and for the board's consideration in particular of the launching of a sustainability planning process for the township. And the primary audience for this workshop is the Board of Commissioners, and I'm so grateful for those who were able to brave the weather and other commitments, including neighborhood association meetings this evening, to be with us for as much of the evening as they are able to spend with us. And I have to say, I'm very proud that we have assembled a terrifically well-informed panel, most of whom live and or work, teach or attend school here in Lower Merion. And we hope you, the commissioners in particular, will be provoked to question what you hear, demand clarification, and engage our panelists in discussion. And we have provided segments throughout the program specifically for your questions and hopefully our answers. And I can't thank our panelists enough for volunteering their time and expertise to this workshop. They have, like all of you, very busy lives. And it's a sign of the importance that they attach to these issues that they've made themselves available to us and to you. You can learn their detailed credentials from the workshop brochure. I want to especially thank our senior planning staff member, Andrea Campisi, for her contributions to the logistics of this event. For the public in general who are here, and I welcome you, I'd like to see you, we have provided 3x5 cards, and if you have questions, we would ask that you inscribe them on the cards, and we will take them as time permits during the last session of the program, which is will be a panel roundtable. Brian, did you want to say anything else? I somehow preempted.
You did. I apologize for the
Understood. With that, why don't we just then get started? I'm delighted to then introduce the first segment of the program, which is devoted to a discussion of the science and consequences of climate change. And our speakers will be Tamar Norquist, followed by Jesse Lytle, followed by Dr. Dan Wolk. So, Tamar?
So I was thinking that I might do this standing. I think I will stand at the podium. So thank you very much, David. As my bio says, at Shipley, I teach chemistry, and I am the sustainability coordinator there. And my part of this talk tonight is to just explain the basic science of climate change. And then everybody else will talk to you about municipalities and constructs and things like that. So, because I'm a chemistry teacher, I have to start this talk by telling you the definition of chemistry. Chemistry is the branch of science that studies the matter of the physical world and the changes and the energy changes that that matter undergoes. And when I think about climate change, it is exactly at the nexus of those two things. And as I always tell my students, all of us know a lot more about chemistry than you might think you know, because you've been living among the matter of the world for your entire life, and you've been making very astute observations. So one thing that you know, even though you might not realize you know it, is that different kinds of matter interact with energy in different ways. Some kinds of matter don't really interact with energy at all, or much at all. A great example of that is styrofoam, which I know might be a little bit of a touchy subject given the EAC, but if you'll forgive me. So styrofoam doesn't really absorb energy at all, which is why we pour our coffee into it, right? Doesn't absorb it, heat stays in the coffee. Other kinds of matter absorb energy but let go of it very quickly. And a great example of that is aluminum, right? It has what's called a high heat capacity, which means, and if you've ever cooked with aluminum foil, you know that you pull it out of the oven, it's hot, and then it's very quickly cool because it lets go of heat quickly. But some kinds of matter absorb energy and hold onto it really well. And a great example of that is water, which we all know because if you've ever sat in front of a hot cup of tea and tried to let it cool, you know that that takes a long time because water holds heat. And what's true of liquid water is also true of gaseous water. Water vapor also holds heat, which we all know very well because when the temperature was 92 degrees outside, which did you want? A high humidity day or a low humidity day, right? Water vapor holds heat just as much as liquid water. And the fact that water vapor is so effective at holding heat makes it what we call a greenhouse gas, which I know that everyone has heard about. The definition of a greenhouse gas is a gas that holds a lot of heat. And the issue with greenhouse gases in our environment is that the heat from the sun comes down, is absorbed, and is not let go, and we have a warming climate. Now, as I say, I know that everybody has, heard a lot about greenhouse gases, and probably anyone who's ever spoken to you about it was not talking about water vapor. They were talking about carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is the big one. Water vapor is a greenhouse gas, as is methane, as is nitrous oxide. But carbon dioxide is the big one. The reason I chose water is just because we all know water, we all relate to water. And that brings me to this. So this is one of my all-time favorite equations in chemistry. There are others, but this is the one I'm talking about now. So that CXHY term. Okay, so that's obviously a variable, a dummy term, and it stands for all organic compounds, organic chemistry being the enormous branch of chemistry that deals with carbon-based compounds. And within that group, for the purposes of this conversation, is a very important class of compounds called fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are all organics, and that's oil, coal, gas, wood, all that stuff. So that's your fossil fuels. And if you remember your high school chemistry, which I certainly hope you do, you might remember that plus O2 means combustion. Okay, that's burning. That's the chemical, that is what burning is. It's things chemically combined with oxygen. So this is the equation for the combustion of an organic. And this is the equation for burning fossil fuels. And as we can all see, the product side is carbon dioxide and water vapor. Okay? And that's it. When we burn fossil fuels, this is what is released. This graph shows the trend in the consumption of fossil fuels since the Industrial Revolution. I just think it speaks for itself. It's gone up in a way that could not really be fathomed very much by human thinking. And all of that is more of those products. The last thing I want to say is this. Whenever we talk about climate change, there's always this question. There is this hovering question in our world of whether it's true and whether it is human caused. So the scientific community is nearly completely agreed that the answer to those two questions is yes. And the foremost voice on this is a body called the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's a group of the leading 1,300 climate scientists of the world. It's overseen by the UN. And 4 years ago, they put out a major study that said that they could say with upwards of 95% certainty that climate change is very much happening, and over the past 50 years, humans have had an impact on it. And as an aside, and I'm sure there are scientists in this room, scientists never say they're 100% certain of anything. It's just not what we do. So upwards of 90% 95% certain is about as far as we go. So I'm here because I'm representing the scientific community. And the work that science does is to observe the world very carefully, to collect the data and to interpret that with as much accuracy and truth as we can. We believe that this is real, and we believe that humans are a big part of it. And the question now for us is what we're going to do about it. Thank you very much. I hand you off to my esteemed colleague, Jesse Lytle, to talk about that.
The magic of technology. Here we go. Can we flip on the fly? Check that out. Thank you, Tamar. That was great. So my role here is to talk about the impacts of climate change. And it's a huge topic. We could talk about it for years. The impacts are global. They're huge. They are multidimensional. But we're not going to tackle that all tonight. We're here to talk about Lower Merion. So this is going to be a high-level gloss. I'll allude to many topics. We're not going to talk about ocean acidification. We're not going to talk about forest fires because they're not sort of first-order impacts on Lower Merion. But we all know they're out there, and we would feel those things in secondary and tertiary ways. So just to give you a little confidence, you might recognize the shape of this chart. It looks a lot like Tamar's. And this is just to reiterate that we're dealing with a fossil fuel problem, and this is annual output of fossil fuels. And the fossil fuels in the air are going to stay with us for 100 to 1,000 years, some of them. So they're in the atmosphere. You might wonder what happens if we cut fossil fuel production or burning to zero now. Well, within about 20 years, half of the carbon dioxide would fall out of the atmosphere. So that's just to say that this issue is solvable if we give it time, that natural cycles can help us if we give them a chance to catch up. But what is the impact? That's what I'm here to talk about. Well, the first thing is that it's getting hot. And this is observable, verifiable. 4 of the hottest years in recorded human history are the last 4 years. We might wonder in Lower Merion, is that true everywhere? Is it true for us? It is true for us too. This is our local temperature data, 1895 to 2015, and you'll see a 4-degree increase in average heat here in the Delaware Valley. We still might wonder though, there are all these weather anomalies. We might remember in the spring, in March, we thought we were ready for spring, and it was cold, it was lousy. So how does that happen, that the climate is warming, but we're still having these cold days? And sometimes we have, we have spectacles like Congress people walking into the Capitol with snowballs in their hands saying, see, there is no global warming. So let's just get into this data a little bit. This is our average summer temperatures from 1951 to 1980. It's a classic bell curve. So the white are the days in the middle, pretty average, and then we've got some standard deviations of cold, standard deviations of hot. And the important thing to remember here, as we look at this baseline, is that the human race and our society is really well adapted to the mean, what normally happens, and maybe a standard deviation or two to one side or the other. We thrive in that, right? We've made incredible progress. Once we get outside of that, things get a little shakier. So over time, let's watch what happens to our bell curve. This is 1983 through 93, and you'll see that temperatures have shifted. We're getting hotter on average. We still have plenty of cold days, but we have more hot days, and we have a tail now on the right side of really hot days. That's 4 to 5 standard deviations out. Another decade, and we shift even farther, and another decade, we shift even farther. Now remember that band in the middle from 1950 to 1980 when we thought, we're really good at living in the mean and close to the mean. Well, most of our world now is outside of that mean and standard deviations away. And we feel that stress all the time. It's stressing our systems. You might remember late August when it was so hot, things just weren't happening. Outside work sites couldn't convene. If you're a tennis fan, you saw Roger Federer crack. I mean, that's crazy stuff. The upshot is, here in Metro Philadelphia, by the end of the century, it's going to feel more like southern Texas climatically. This is just based on the carbon that's already in the atmosphere. This is not if. This is where we're heading. What happens when it gets hot? Well, again, when we step outside of our standard deviations, the world we've built does not react the way we want it to. It got so hot in Oaks that this road buckled in the heat, and that's just an example of how our infrastructure wasn't meant to deal with these extremes. Human beings were not meant to deal with these extremes. This person was suffering from heat exhaustion. She ended up being okay. Dr. Wolk will be talking more about the impact of climate change on human health. As Tamar alluded, water holds heat really well, and this is important as we think about the effects of climate change, even here in Lower Merion. So most of the heat from climate change is going into the oceans. Why does that matter? Well, one reason that matters is because of storms. And we've seen Florence in the news, and we could show the same imagery with Florence. This is a post-mortem on Harvey. So you remember how devastating Harvey was. Harvey crossed a Gulf of Mexico that was 7 degrees hotter than normal. Hot water means that there's more precipitation, higher wind speed, and a larger storm surge with every storm. So that's just happening. And this is what Houston looked like, because they built a city based on the mean, the average, what you're used to. And when the rainfall was outside of that average, they could not take it. We can say, phew, thank goodness we're not in the hurricane belt in the Gulf of Mexico, but we're not safe from it. You might remember Hurricane Irene hit Philadelphia in 2011, and this is what our downtown of Center City looked like. And this is indicative of what will happen. Again, not if, but when. Cyclonic storms don't only come in the form of hurricanes, they also are nor'easters, and again, a crazy March. We had 4 nor'easters. So I work at Haverford College. We had to shut the college down for a few days. If you have school kids, you probably kept them home for a while. It was really disruptive. Caused a lot of damage. 2 of those storms cost over $1 billion in the Northeast. We're actually in the crosshairs here. So if you look at how heavy downpours and heavy precipitation events are increasing nationally, the Northeast is getting the worst of it, because we're getting weather coming across the country from the Great Lakes, we're getting weather coming up the coast, we're getting nor'easters off the ocean. So we have more downpours here than anywhere else. And even looking inside Pennsylvania, in Metro Philadelphia, we are way worse off than even nearby Lancaster or Harrisburg. Now this matters a lot, actually. I mean, as we saw today with this heavy downpours, they cause erosion, they cause damage, and they don't replenish the aquifer either, right? The water just rushes off the land back into the river or the ocean, and you don't get the benefit to farmlands or the public water supply. And you get scenes like this in Bryn Mawr. This was not today. You get scenes like this in Ardmore as the soil gets saturated. Now, we could talk a lot about precipitation. The same phenomena that leads to all that precipitation, namely the heat drawing moisture out of the oceans and creating rain, actually leads to drought by drawing the moisture out of land. And we feel that here in Pennsylvania. We're losing our snow coverage. We will probably see 60% less snow coverage in the state by the middle of the century. We're seeing droughts. So as nearby as Lancaster County in central Pennsylvania, over the past few years, we've had drought emergencies where the state government has had to step in. We haven't been able to have local produce. The farmers there are hurting. As temperatures rise, water use, of course, does too. So this is the cruel, vicious cycle, right? As we have more heat and less water, we need more of it. The Delaware River Basin provides water to about 15 million people. And this is a chart of the salt line. So that's how far the salt from the Atlantic Ocean creeps up the river because of tides and water levels. The little purple line there is where it normally is outside of Wilmington. In a drought, it can go up to that red line. And up at the number 110, that's where the city of Philadelphia pulls water in to drink. So as we get droughts on land, there's less water flowing into the basin, down the river, supplying fresh drinking water to our region. This is a map of the world showing where the warming is happening from the Industrial Revolution till today. So I want you to just mind the patterns and where the heat happens. Right, so that's what it was in 1880. Here's where it was by 2016. So obviously, mostly in the north. The problem with that is that's where most of the water, or much of the water of the world, is locked up in ice. So you have glaciers like this in 1935 that look like this more recently. Where does that water go? Obviously, it goes into the oceans. Now, again, in Lower Merion, we're okay. Our coastline is not a Lower Merion issue, but it's part of our region, and so we need to be mindful of it. And we know that our whole region is vulnerable. If you spend time on the shore, you'll remember Superstorm Sandy, exemplary of what will happen as water levels rise and storms continue. It also affects the salt line, right? As the ocean gets higher, the salt water will push up and up and up. So between drought and ocean level rise, drinking water supply in our area is going to be more and more stressed. Now that's a lot of dire stuff, and you might wonder if the scientific community is trying to over-catastrophize this. This data is actually from the insurance industry, because at the end of the day, when we have disasters, they get paid for most of the time. And the insurance industry is the one that takes the brunt of it. And so this is a catalog of the extreme weather catastrophes that have happened over the last 30 years or so. Obviously, the trend is up. Last year, the total dollar value of damage because of severe weather in the United States was over $300 billion. That's a huge number. And of that, 38% was insured, 62% of that was uninsured. That means the tab is picked up by homeowners, businesses, schools, municipalities. So this is something we have to watch. Another effect of climate change is that habitat is changing, right? It gets warmer, animals can thrive elsewhere. So this is just an example with one species, the Aedes aegypti, which is a certain kind of mosquito. It carries the Zika virus and unfortunately is now comfortable in the mid-Atlantic region. What's interesting is that land species are on average moving poleward about 15 feet a day. So ticks are more and more comfortable where we are. trees are less comfortable where we are, or at least the trees we're used to. So many of the sort of heritage trees that we think of as defining Pennsylvania and our community actually are not going to thrive by the end of the century. And we're starting to see that. My employer, Haverford College, is an arboretum, and a lot of the tree species we planted aren't thriving so much anymore. And just over time, they get weaker and weaker, and between that and storms, you see more and more trees coming down. And this is just a reality that our community is going to face as we think about our landscape. Climate change is affecting our food supply. I'm not going to go deep into this, but just make a mental note that we need to be aware of this. It's a whole network of factors that combine to affect, in particular, our staple crops, which together make up about 2/3 of human caloric intake. So with every degree of rising, there's more and more stress on the world food supply. More locally, Pennsylvania agriculture will be suffering from a combination of these issues, including pests, invasive plants, and we're going to need more chemicals to deal with that in order to keep feeding our growing population. Dairy farmers will be feeling the heat. Cows don't like heat. Production goes down. Milk will get more expensive. It's just one sort of example among many. I'm going to let Dan talk about health, but this is just a preview of the many factors involved. Just in closing, I'd like to think about the total cost of carbon. So David at the beginning asked, is action or inaction more expensive? Well, right now, climate change is considered the #1 threat to the global economy for all the reasons we've discussed and many more. And the financial system and the world government is starting to really bear down on this. So the G20 has a task force. It's creating a new voluntary climate-related financial disclosure process. And what this means, this sounds pretty technocratic, but if you have an organization and you have investors, you're going to have to get your head around what your exposure is from climate change. Nobody's going to want to invest in a business, a municipality, if they think their investment isn't safe. And Moody's is taking the lead on this, incorporating climate risk into their rating systems. So obviously there are many directions this is coming from. I'm going to stop there because there's a lot to talk about, and we can go back to any specifics during the panel discussion.
Thanks, Jesse and Tamar. You presented a lot of background information for my talk. And I'm going to present action on climate change as an opportunity to improve not only our general public health, but the health of our community here in Lower Merion. I've been concerned about climate change for a long time, and I'd like to start with a little historical note. I'd like somebody to guess which president said this: air pollution is no longer confined to isolated places. This generation has altered the composition of the atmosphere on a global scale through radioactive materials and a steady increase in carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels. Yeah. Closer. Lyndon Johnson. So, I was 9 years old in 1965, a preteen on the first Earth Day. Rachel Carson is the person who really got my attention, and I've been concerned about what's happening to our planet ever since. However, scientists have been concerned about climate change since the very beginning of the graphs that Jesse and Tamar showed, the late 19th century. They were wondering, well, what could be the impact of putting all this carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, because they knew, based on studying chemistry, as Tamar explained to us, that carbon dioxide and water vapor hold heat. And what if you hold heat against the planet. Will that warm up the planet? And scientists have now had about 150 years to study this question, and that's why at this point, especially with more and more technology available to get more accurate data, we can say with 95% certainty that yes, this is a real phenomenon and we're the cause. But even if are you going to bet on that 5%, that chance that maybe we're wrong, and if we cut back in fossil fuels that it's not going to have any impact? I'm here to say that it will have an impact anyway by benefiting our public health. So here are the impacts that Jesse already outlined about the impact on climate change here in Lower Merion. And our fellow Americans in North Carolina last week found out that even being inland doesn't make you safe. And Lower Merion has had its share of severe weather events. We've had seen the impacts, but especially our elder population. And I'm a geriatrician. I work part-time at Beaumont at Bryn Mawr, right across from Harrington High School. And even in a place like Beaumont, which has a generator, et cetera, those systems can fail. And we saw, for example, in Florida, how an entire nursing home had multiple deaths because they failed on a human operational level to make their residents of that nursing home safe, and people died from heat exhaustion and dehydration, even though there was a hospital right across the street. So being human, we know that no matter what governments can set up as safety nets, there's still going to be consequences. How do we mitigate those consequences? By preparing as best we can. So I appreciate the Lower Merion commissioners listening to this presentation to really put requests for additional programs and bolstering our infrastructure so it doesn't fail in the heat or too much rain or too cold, so it can function to keep us safe. Also, as a doctor, I see one case of illness at a time. I can't, from my office, necessarily recognize an epidemic, but our public health system can, and we know that there are more and more cases of Lyme disease, now year-round. I'm seeing cases in my office in February. What's this rash, doctor? I just came back from a ski trip, but there wasn't any snow, and we just went out for a hike. Well, it looks like Lyme disease in February. So we're going to see that more and more. And then in the summer, as Jesse pointed out, more and more emerging infections for our area, like Zika virus, brought by mosquitoes, which have a higher metabolic rate when it is warm, so they reproduce faster, and so do the viruses inside them. Now, the opportunity here is that while climate warming temperatures increase the ozone and particulate levels from air pollution from burning fossil fuels, if we cut back on the fossil fuel use, then we can have a huge impact, and I'm about to show that to you. The other impact to not forget is that hot weather stresses us out, especially if you have no air conditioning. There's actually a good correlation between the rates of violent crime and summer temperatures. That puts an additional burden on our law enforcement and first responders, as well as our school teachers, social workers, etc. So the opportunity is that graduating from fossil fuels has tremendous health benefits for the populace. The other good news is, I'm sure you all know, we've built up a lot of academic credit towards this graduation. We have a whole array of alternative energy sources that are working, that are pricing their way down to be not only competitive, but superior, in other words, more cost effective than fossil fuel use, and including for lighting this building and heating it, for example. So I'm going to just present two papers that can illustrate what the impact is. The first is from this year. Researchers published a study of the past 2 years of study of premature and low birth weight deliveries in northern New Jersey, downwind from a very dirty coal-fired power plant. This power plant, when it was operating, produced more sulfur dioxide and other pollutants than all of the other coal-burning power plants combined in New Jersey. It was right on the Delaware River on the border between Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Why was it allowed to operate? Because of a loophole written for it in the clean air regulations. Because it was an older plant, the utility said, we can't possibly spend enough money to make this a clean burning plant, and we'll have to pass the cost on to the ratepayers. But unfortunately, people downwind of the plant paid a heavy price. They looked at birth weights and preterm births, as I said, from 2014 to 2016. The plant shut down in 2014. And what they discovered was the likelihood of having a low birth weight baby went down by about 15%, and a premature birth by about 28%. Now, those of you who have had a family member or personally had a premature or low birth weight baby know how hard that is, not only for you, but for the child for their entire lifetime. The impact is felt. And on a population level, that impact is then felt by our society, including our school district, our criminal justice system, and the social services that these now adults need to be successful in life. So if you were pregnant, wouldn't you want to have a 28% lower risk of having a preterm baby? Yes. Would you choose a cleaner energy source in order to do that? Well, of course. So now on the other end of the age spectrum is the Medicare population. These researchers in the New England Journal of Medicine published a study where they looked at the entire Medicare population over the entire country, and they were able to match mortality among that population with how much air pollution there was in the person's zip code. And they found there was an association, here we go, between mortality and air pollution. Now, this doesn't tell us cause and effect, it's an association, but again, if you push the air pollution curve down, you ought to see lower mortality rates. So as doctors, we see these patients individually with cardiovascular disease, diabetes, stroke, heart attack, emphysema. Many of those people who have never smoked and don't have other risk factors, pollution's one of the factors. So last study by West in 2013 calculated how much it would cost to take a ton of carbon dioxide, prevent it from being released in the first place by cleaning up our energy system. And it came to less than $30 per ton of CO2 emissions avoided. Then his team calculated just the health benefits of cleaner energy by reducing the pollution from burning those fossil fuels. Per ton of CO2 avoided, the savings, just in health, was $200. So is there anyone here who would tell me that $30 is bigger than $200? Okay? So clearly, this is a huge dividend that we would reap from improving our energy system, as a side benefit from also having safer, more secure, and cleaner communities. Thank you very much.
The impact that the phenomenon that our three presenters have described is already being experienced by those of us of a certain age, a certain maturity, and it's nothing to compare with what our children and grandchildren will experience if we sit on our hands. I thought it would be useful to bring to bear on this discussion the perspective of two Lower Merion students. I'd invite up Emma Deutsch and Homa Mirzai. Homa and Emma are members of the Harrington High School Environmental Club, and they're going to just spend a couple of minutes giving you their perspective on climate action as high school students. So thank you for coming and sharing with us. Whatever you're comfortable doing. You can sit or you can stand here.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Emma. I go to Harrington High School.
And I'm Homa, and I also go to Harrington. We want to thank Mr. Richmond for inviting us here today, Mr. Ferraro for arranging everything on our end, and to the board for having us. Thank you.
We are 2 out of 4 officers of the Harrington Environmental Club, and the club is steadily growing every year. Currently, we have 72 signups ranging from freshmen to seniors. Judging from the growing size of our club, Harrington students care about the environment, and we are concerned about global warming. We have overwhelming concern about the impacts, but we are determined to be optimistic because we see a path toward ameliorating climate change. Even during our short lifetimes, we have seen the disastrous effects of climate change. Our continent has been hit with an all-time high of hurricanes in past years, including those that hit Puerto Rico and just recently North Carolina, causing extensive damage. Just this summer, Radnor Middle School experienced incredible flooding, and Philadelphia schools had to dismiss students early during their first few weeks due to extreme heat and humidity. While we cannot reverse the damage that has been done completely, there is no time like the present to start counteracting climate change. The general lifestyle here in the township creates a huge level of consumption. The main line has excessive food waste, gas usage, and uses a lot of resources that, through industrial production, contribute to climate change. We need to take responsibility for that footprint, and in doing so, help to lessen it.
Encouragement and education are great first steps towards improvement and sustainability. The EAC has a page on the township's website with some encouragement to residents on sustainability, like shop locally, use LED light bulbs, reuse rainwater, and reusable shopping bags. But there's no reason the township can't encourage through action. The township could also publicize the benefits, for example, of driving an electric or hybrid car over gas. By implementing district-owned electric car charging stations, if all police cars in Lower Merion were electric, not only would the township be reducing its amount of fuel used, but it would set a good example to citizens. By building township buildings sustainably, maybe more Lower Merion residents would build solar panels, green roofs, or geothermal heating, or even just use LED light bulbs. Plus, it shouldn't be out of the question to tax plastics, which could take considerable amounts of fuel to produce, or require new developments of a certain size to LEED certified for sustainability. We're not saying that the township hasn't been showing any effort on this front. The Ballackinwood Library, for example, was recently renovated to include a geothermal heating system, which is so cool. But let's not call this a victory and stop there. It would be in our interest for every township-owned building to run on geothermal, solar, or externally purchased sustainable energy.
We believe that Lower Merion Township and other areas like it, due to our socioeconomic privilege, have an obligation to pioneer environmental sustainability. As a society, if we have the means to make a world a better place, we should always take advantage of that. We don't need to tackle the carbon emissions of large cities like Philadelphia when we can push suburban legislature to use our tax resources to build sustainable architecture and install renewable energy sources. A lot of our culture is based on what we can do for the community and how we can make a positive impact on the world. We understand that our generation and school district is much more educated on the impacts of climate change and greenhouse gases than others, and we want to take advantage of that, but we can't do it alone or right now. It's time to put aside any differences and cooperate towards reducing our society and our township's footprint. The township needs to establish an environmental planning committee, preferably with an officer in charge so that we have someone held accountable for creating real change here.
The high school, colleges, and general wealth that surround us have untapped potential to help. So why should we settle for doing what's enough or just average for a planet around here? We understand that there are other priorities and they get in the way, but as high schoolers, we know better than anyone how that happens, and it's called procrastination. And we know it when we don't admit it, and we know better than anyone that we shouldn't do it. We hear it from our parents more than often, and it's the act of doing nothing about the situation might as well be denying that it's there at all. We're not demanding that Lower Merion go vegan or live without electricity. We're asking you to do more than consider, more than listening to us talk, and more than encouraging sustainability on the township website. Let's stop talking the talk and walk the walk. As Ben Franklin once said, you may delay, but time will not, and lost time is never found again. Thank you so much for having us.
According to the program, we have set aside approximately 10 minutes at this point for questions directed to our panelists, and we can bring Homa and Emma back if you'd like to pose questions to them as well, particularly the commissioners, both those in the forefront and the back front. We'd be happy to hear from you if there are questions. And you get a chance to be heard on the microphone.
Excuse me. My name is Carl Shuttle, and I was born and raised in Lower Merion Township. I spent a number of years in New England, returned recently back to Lower Merion. Several points. The town in which I last lived in Massachusetts was Wellesley, and in Wellesley they have a dump. And the schools, the colleges and the high schools, created the momentum for the dump. And they built this dump that collects everything you can think of. And without belaboring the point, last year the dump returned $78,000 to the town. So $78,000 profit to the town, which actually went to the school district. So the kids in the school district are perpetuating this whole idea of don't let their parents throw things out that they shouldn't. I spent a good part of the summers in Maine, and the town in which I live and all the surrounding towns banned plastic grocery bags a long time ago. And it is so well received that you can't imagine. And it takes leadership. Pennsylvania is so far behind in this regard that New England is way ahead of us in every regard of reducing carbon footprint. So there are a whole lot of things we can do about climate change. Whether we've reached the tipping point is another question, but reducing our carbon footprint is a basic responsibility of everybody and every government. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Does anybody on the panel want to react to the notion that we have kind of a dearth of action at the state level? The federal level might even be perceived as being regressive. So where does that leave us in terms of local responsibility? That's like we call that a softball. If anybody wants to take a shot at it.
Sure. Well, I'd like to give one example that I think is a very good analog for action on climate change, and that is cigarette smoking. As a doctor, I know that the scientific evidence on climate change being human-caused and what the projected impacts are going to be if we do nothing is as clear as the link between cigarette smoking and human health. Now, even up until the 1990s, there were still people debating about whether or not cigarette smoking was a public health problem. When people proposed laws to ban smoking in public places, there was a big pushback from the tobacco industry and their lobbyists and bar owners who said they lose business. You walk around Ardmore today, just stop into any bar. Number one, it smells great. You can smell the beer. Okay. Number two, you see all sorts of people there inside, including children, where parents would not take their kids into a smoky bar ever. And so there's a definite public health benefit and an economic benefit. And I think that is also a good analogy for climate change action.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you for the softball, David. Municipalities are where the action is these days. For a long time in climate action, the largest cities of the country have been taking the lead because they're dealing with real problems on the ground. And that's true not just in climate change, but in so many issues, right? The partisanship that we see nationally breaks down because we have citizens who want real solutions, and you can act locally in practical ways. There are townships not too far from us that have already committed to 100% renewable energy, including Kennett Square. I'm going to blank on the others. Lancaster did now? That's great. I mean, Westchester, thank you. Yep. So there are examples of that. My home borough, Narberth, is going to, in a month, consider the Commonwealth's first plastic straw ban and plastic bag fee, which is a baby step, but it shows, I think, the political will that citizens have and want to see their leaders take. So I think there are lots of opportunities to choose the actions that work for the community. And they can have a multiplier effect. If we find good solutions here in Montgomery County, they will have traction elsewhere.
Are there any other questions for these panelists in particular on the subjects that they've addressed? If not, then I'm proud to report we have one person wishing to speak.
I just wanted to ask our Harriton High School students, what got you started? Because you really are the hope of all of this.
I mean, really, it comes from our education. In every science class at Harriton, the topic is at least touched on. And I think all of the students, or at least most of them in the district, are aware of climate change, whether or not they believe in it. And I think if we keep educating people on the topic and the risks of the topic, people will feel inspired to try to make change.
And I think it's important to note that with all the information that gets like through social media and stuff, I mean, it's not even our Harriton, it's more like generational. We all understand the impacts and we want change, but we're all either halfway not able to vote, or we're not able to start change other than like do political, like social movements. But that's really.
We can participate in a workshop, community
Or we
workshop.
can
And make your voices heard. And I thank you for doing so. So I want to thank these panelists.